All right, my friends, ladies and gentlemen, it is 7:30 on a Monday evening, so let's get started. Thank you all for joining us for lesson 3 of this JLI course, Journey of the Soul. Tonight's class is entitled, it's funny, interesting. Usually I say it's entitled and I go on to the next slide and they have the name of the particular class in the next slide. I've got to work on my cues because in this course, for some reason, they didn't put the names of the particular classes in the slides. But tonight's class is called The Morning After Morning with a U. I will make note of the fact that I have, as I usually do, I have one token participant here in person. Carlos is here in person with me tonight. Carlos, if you're here in person, you just have to know it's your job to laugh at my jokes. I can't tell if anyone's laughing in Zoom because they're all muted. So you're the one who's required to laugh at my jokes. And on that note, I'm reminded it's not so much a joke as much as it is a very, very powerful story, actually, and one that I heard. Good evening, Damien. Missed that face. As much as the story that I once heard in rabbinical school, and it always left a very powerful impact on me, which I think is a very fitting beginning to tonight's discussion. They tell the story of a stuntman who once attempted to walk across Niagara Falls on a tightrope. And everyone came out, and the media came out, and people came out to watch this daredevil walk across Niagara Falls on a tightrope. And he stands at one end of the falls and he says, "Who thinks I can walk across Niagara Falls on a tightrope?" And the crowd cheers. And sure enough, he walks across Niagara Falls on a tightrope, and he gets to the other end and he turns again to the crowd and he says, "Who thinks I can walk across Niagara Falls on a tightrope while pushing a wheelbarrow?" And the crowd roars its approval. "Unbelievable, you're the best." And sure enough, they hand him up a wheelbarrow and he walks across Niagara Falls on a tightrope pushing a wheelbarrow. And he makes it to the other side, and the crowd is just delirious at this point. He turns to the crowd and he says, "Friends, who thinks I can walk across Niagara Falls on a tightrope pushing a wheelbarrow with someone inside the wheelbarrow?" And the crowd is going insane. "Wow, you can do this. You're amazing." And he looks out at the crowd, at the guy cheering the loudest, and he says, "Sir, could you do me a favor? Would you mind coming up here and climbing inside the wheelbarrow?" And the point of the story, obviously, is that whilst we might clap and cheer and laugh and enjoy whatever it is in life, there really is a large gap between theory, what we like to believe in concept, and practice. The reason why I bring that up is because the reality is we have had 2 lessons together, 2 very interesting, fascinating lessons. And the truth is that we've discussed a lot about death and the soul's transition. And we've talked about that in somewhat positive and beneficial terms. But to the innocent observer, one might make the observation that the entire frame of reference that we were using was somewhat detached, a little bit too theoretical, maybe a little bit too theological. The reality is that when, God forbid, any of us lose a loved one, for most of us, it is the single most painful experience that we will go through on this earth. The pain of losing a loved one, the pain of having to say goodbye of someone near and dear to us. And so while we've spent a lot of time talking about the spiritual significances and what happens to the soul, and it's so wonderful for the soul, and so on and so forth, the reality is that for those that are left behind, there is a lot of mourning after morning with a U. There is a lot to process and a lot to deal with as we talk about losing loved ones. And so this class, the focus of this class is really going to be on what happens to the loved ones that we leave behind, and how Torah views the mourning process for those that are left behind, and how Torah provides antidotes for the ache in the heart that so many of us feel. We're going to begin by discussing a loss that 2 different people suffered. Texts 1 and 2 are taken from 2 different experiences that 2 different private individuals went through in this world. Join me together. Let's read together text 1 on page 84. Heather Lindquist was in the kitchen cleaning up after lunch when she heard a dull thud. It sounded as if it came from the hallway, and it was just a little too loud to ignore. "Boys," she yelled, "what are you up to?" There was no answer. She found her 2 boys playing quietly on the couch in the living room. They giggled. "You joker," she said with a smile. "What was that sound?" They shrugged. "Where's your father?" Without waiting for an answer, she ran toward the hallway. She cried out in fear when she found her husband, John, writhing on the floor. John had severe asthma. He was taking a new medication, and it had seemed to be working. But suddenly he had collapsed in the worst attack he'd ever had. Heather tried everything she could think of to save her husband's life. Then she called an ambulance. The rest was a blur. John died of cardiac arrest on the way to the hospital. Heather was 34 years old. Her boys were 5 and 7. At that moment, John's death felt like the worst thing that could have ever happened to her. And I think we'd all agree that that's probably the case. Heather Lindquist had lived her entire life in the same quiet suburban community in northern New Jersey. She and John had been high school sweethearts. They married and purchased a small ranch-style house. They had children. They got a dog. The schools were good, and the community was stable. Heather thought that the television was on more than it should be, but other than that, everything seemed in order. Then John died, and she had to rethink it all. Now she was a single parent. She had to find new ways to earn money and also find extra time to be with her boys. And somehow she had to contain everyone's anguish. She found strength she didn't know she had. It was lonely and painful at times, but Heather found meaning and vigor and even joy in the idea that she was going to make it. I expected to collapse. I really did. That's what I wanted to do. That would have been the easiest thing to do, Heather explained, but I couldn't. Each day I got up and did what I had to do. The days passed and somehow it was okay. The boys were great. They were upset in the beginning, of course. We all were. They hung in there and we stayed together. I love those boys so much. John would have been proud of them. Okay, pretty conventional. It's a very sad story, obviously, but a pretty conventional reaction, I think we could call that. Let's move on to text number 2. In 2004, Stephanie Moldberg of Short Hills, New Jersey, lost her son Eric, who was 13, to Ewing sarcoma, bone cancer. 4 years after Eric's death, Miss Moldberg, now 48, walked around like a zombie. I felt guilty all the time, guilty about living, she said. I couldn't walk into the deli because Eric couldn't go there any longer. I couldn't play golf because Eric couldn't play golf. My life was a mess. And I couldn't talk to my friends about it because after a while I didn't want to hear about it. Stephanie, you need to get your life back, they'd say. But how could I? On birthdays, I'd shut the door and take the phone off the hook. Eric couldn't have any more birthdays. Why should I? Having read these two texts side by side, I think the best way to start the class is to take a look at the question for discussion on page 86. Heather and Stephanie reacted differently to their respective losses. Is one response healthier than the other? Is Heather in denial? Is Stephanie overreacting? Why did the two women react differently? If you know someone who did or did not deal well with loss, what might have made that person equipped or ill-equipped to cope with their grief? We have these two side-by-side experiences. Two suburban American women who suffered death, who suffered loss in their immediate families in rather tragic circumstances between the two of them. Those seem to be the similarities between the stories. And when we compare their reactions side by side, we cannot find two different reactions. And so as humans, we judge. We take a look at these two different stories featuring these two different reactions side by side, and we wonder, is Heather in denial or is Stephanie overreacting? It sounds like the premise of that question suggests that there is an appropriate way to grieve. There's a way to grieve that is somehow socially acceptable. There's the way that quote unquote normal people grieve. And if you deviate from that path, well, then we wonder where is the middle of the road and who has gone to this side of the road and who has gone to that side of the road. I think any thinking person takes a look at these two people and comes to two very simple conclusions based on these stories. Number one, no two people are alike. And number two, no two circumstances are the same. Heather and Stephanie could have suffered the exact same loss. They both could have lost a 13-year-old son to Ewing sarcoma, and nevertheless would have acted vastly differently because people are different. Beyond the fact that people are different, as we read in texts 1 and 2, the reality of the situation is circumstances are vastly different. And I want to focus on that for a second. I want to focus on the differences in circumstances between Heather's story and Stephanie's story. For starters, those of us who are parents will know that there are things that we may not do for ourselves as human beings, but we would do them for our children. The story goes to great lengths to talk about the fact that Heather had two children who are now left without a father. Two children for whom Heather was the only adult, the only grown-up in their life. And Heather had to pull herself together. She says She says she has to pull herself together for the sake of her children. We don't know much about Stephanie's circumstances. Is Stephanie an only mom? Is Stephanie a single mom? Is Stephanie someone who has someone else in her life? We don't know that from the circumstances that are shown to us in the stories that we have read. Let's contrast another difference in the circumstances. Heather lost her husband literally from one moment to the next. Everyone's kind of playing at home. The two boys are playing in the living room. They're being quiet. Suddenly she hears a thud and her husband has dropped dead. There was no suffering beforehand. There was no pain. There was no lead up of very, very adverse experiences that led to Heather's husband's tragic, tragic death. On the other hand, Stephanie, in addition to losing a 15-year-old child, she loses a 15-year-old child who suffered from Ewing sarcoma, a horrible, horrible form of bone cancer for multiple years. One can only imagine the emotional toll that all those experiences must have taken on Stephanie before she lost her son. And so obviously, as we see up here on the big board, beyond the fact that no two people are alike, and it's unfair to categorize Heather as being in denial or Stephanie as overreacting, furthermore, no two circumstances are the same. Both Heather and Stephanie, we can assume and we can all agree, are dealing with the situation to the best of their ability, are reacting to the best of their particular and given situation. Because the reality is that every situation where people grieve and every grief process is going to be different based on the circumstances that led up to the passing and the people who are experiencing the passing. The reason why I bring that up is because the premise, the idea that Torah will somehow tell us how to grieve is something which requires a little bit of clarification on its face. We all don't grieve the same way. No two human beings express or experience any sort of emotion the same way. Certainly grief, one of the most complex of the emotions that we'll ever feel. And thus to have an assumption that there is a path of grief that we must follow, and there are deviations from the path, and Torah will provide context how to not deviate from the center and get back on the straight and narrow, is obviously something which we must take with a grain of salt. Nevertheless, the question that we will attempt to deal with tonight and talk about tonight is how can one experiencing grief reemerge into life? Obviously, we are not telling somebody what to do and how to do it, but we are really kind of focusing on this general question of how can one experiencing grief reemerge into life. I see there is a question here. Let's take a moment and address it. Says Laura, somewhere in the Torah, doesn't it command us that the living must continue to live, or words to that effect? Yes, Laura, indeed it does. The living must continue to live. As King Solomon says in Ecclesiastes, the living should take to heart. The living should go on to live and permeate their lives with the lessons of their loved one who is departed. But again, it's difficult to command people. You lost someone? Gosh, that must be hard. Take a couple of days and then get back to the program. Obviously, it requires a little bit of sensitivity. And tonight we're going to talk about developing that sort of process that allows people to get back to some sort of a healthy place. Tonight's class, we're going to deal with three general topics. Part number one, we're going to deal with Torah's view of mourning and grief as a concept. Does Torah believe in mourning and grief? Is mourning and grief something which is acceptable, even recommended in the Jewish faith? What does Torah view about mourning and grief? Should that be something which we do experience? Second of all, we're going to deal with the fact that there are many people that suffer with chronic grief, that suffer a loss and are left contending with it for months and months and years. And we're going to provide some ideas, some advice for those who struggle with chronic grief. And lastly, we're going to speak about, for those who are not grieving, for the loved ones, the friends and family of those who are grieving, proper etiquette when visiting the grieving, what to say, what not to say, in a certain sense, what to think and what not to think when visiting someone who is mourning. Before we get into that, are there any questions? Feel free to unmute yourself or chat in the box or chat at me privately, whatever floats your boat.
Hi, I just wanted to say something.
Sure.
You were talking about the two stories, and one with a husband, one with a child.
Mhm.
And I just remember that when my grandmother lost her husband, she would say, how could he have left me to experience this beautiful sunny day all on my own? And yet when her son passed away, she said, my son will not be able to experience this beautiful sunny day.
I like that. So we see even in one person grieving, there's a fundamental difference between who they lose and how they relate to that. Thank you very much for sharing. That's a very succinct way of expressing, I think, a very deep emotion. Thank you for sharing that, Cheryl. Appreciate that. Anybody else? All right, let's get into it. As I mentioned, the first topic we're going to discuss tonight is the idea of mourning. Oh, sorry, there's a question coming in. Can grief be postponed to a later time, or does it have to be done at the time of death? I got a question Wonderful question. Hold on to that. We will address that tonight. And if you still have that at the end of class, give me a holler. As I mentioned, the first topic we're going to discuss tonight is Torah's view of mourning and grief. Is mourning and grief something that we believe in? And we're going to see it's not so clear cut. On the topic of mourning and grief, I would be remiss if I didn't share the following joke. I'm sorry, friends. The reality is there's so many good Jewish jokes about the afterlife, and this is one of them. Harry and Sally were 96 years old. They were married for 74 years. They lived a long, happy, and healthy life. Towards the end, Sally got very rigid about their lifestyle, and they really embarked on this very, very neurotic, healthy lifestyle. They lived to 96. And 96, though they were both in the best of health, they tragically died in a car accident. And they both come up to the pearly gates, and they're shown their slice of heaven where they're going to spend all eternity. And they walk down this path holding hands, and they're strolling down this little garden road up in heaven, and they come towards this mansion, just this absolute mansion, decked out with this beautiful kitchen and a master bath and a jacuzzi and everything that you could see, everything you ever wanted to imagine. And Harry says, "Gosh, Sally, I wonder how much it costs to live there in the afterlife." And there's an angel swooping by, and he says, "Harry, you want that house? It's yours. This is heaven. You've earned it." Wow. Okay. Harry and Sally move into the house, and they're living it up. What a house. I mean, we're talking about a serious mansion. And the mansion has this view overlooking a golf course. I mean, we are talking, Pebble Beach. We are just talking the golf course of all golf courses. And Harry's sitting there in his jacuzzi, and he says, "Sally, wonder what it costs to get a tea time at the golf course." And one of the angels swooping by says, "Harry, you're in heaven. You can golf there whenever you want, however you want. It's heaven. You've earned it. In fact, why don't you guys hit the golf course after lunch? There's a little buffet there in the clubhouse. Why don't you come and see it?" And so they get out of the jacuzzi and they go to the clubhouse, and there's just this lavish buffet in the clubhouse with anything and everything you may have ever wanted to eat. And Harry says to Sally, he says, "Gosh, I wish we could really fill up on a lot of this garbage, but we've gotten addicted to your lifestyle. We're going to get sick." And an angel's walking by, and he says, "Harry, you don't understand. This is heaven. You could eat whatever you want and you won't get sick. This is heaven." And Harry hears that, and he just bursts out crying. And everyone is so touched. He's all emotional about heaven. And Sally puts an arm, and she says, "Harry, dear, what's wrong, sweetheart?" And Harry looks up at her, and he says, "If not for your bran muffins, we could have been here 10 years ago." Thank you, Carlos. I got to laugh in person. So, mourning and grief. What does Judaism believe about mourning and grief? Well, the reason I ask what Judaism believes about mourning and grief is because there are opinions out there that profoundly do not believe in mourning and grief. Chief among them, one of the first written texts that we have that speaks down on the topic of mourning and grief is actually taken from Socrates, the great Greek philosopher who pontificated about a great number of things in life. Some were more widely accepted, some were less widely accepted. One of the things he had a philosophy about was actually the concept of death. Join me for a second on text 3, taken from the Dialogues of Plato, and we'll actually see Socrates' idea, Socrates' concept about the very notion of death. Socrates instructed, "Cebes, please relate the following message to Evenus, and bid him be of good cheer. Say that I would have him come after me by immediately leaving this world if he be a wise man and not tarry, and that today I am likely to be going, for the Athenians say that I must." Simmias said, "What a message for such a man. Having been a frequent companion of his, I should say that as far as I know him, he will never take your advice unless he is obliged." "Why?" said Socrates. "Is not Evenus a philosopher?" "I think that he is," said Simmias. "Then he or any man who has the spirit of philosophy will be willing to die, but he will not take his own life, for that is held to be unlawful. The day may come when you will understand why, though a man is better dead, he is not permitted to be his own benefactor, but must wait for the hand of another." Interestingly enough, says Socrates, all of us are kind of living in a stuck situation. In a perfect sense, all of us would be dead. We are better off dead. says Socrates. Why, though, a man is better dead? For us to take our own lives, for us to take matters into our hands and do what we can do to off ourselves, that's against the law, says Socrates. But frankly, what we are all doing, we are all waiting to die. I had a teacher in yeshiva who used to ask us during his farbrengens, during his times of our spiritual gatherings, he used to turn to people and he used to say, I have a question for you. Are you alive because you are alive? Or are you alive because you have not yet been hit by a truck? There are some people who are alive and their life is a passionate one. They see a purpose and a mission living the life that they currently have. And you have some people that are alive because the angel of death has taken his time getting to them. So they might be on this earth for 70 years, but they're not alive. Socrates was alive because, well, there were no trucks in Greece in the 5th century BCE, but Socrates was alive because practically he hadn't died yet, but he preferred to die. For him, death was a much, much better option because for philosophers, so long as you're stuck in the human gunk, you can't experience the true enlightenment. Only when you are dead, that's something to look forward to. And so in the view of Socrates and the many that ascribe to such a philosophy, obviously mourning and grief are not in vogue for the reason that we prefer death on a certain basic level. Judaism, as you might not be surprised to learn, obviously strongly disavows that perspective. Let's start on the most basic level. Let's read from the Rambam in the Laws of Mourning in his Mishnah Torah and his Magnum Opus text for Laws of Mourning, chapter 1, paragraph 1. Mitzvahs aseh lehisabel al hakrevim. We are biblically commanded to mourn the deaths of our next of kin. Next of kin, we'll get to in a few moments exactly what is the criteria for next of kin, but Judaism does believe in mourning, and not just does believe in mourning. Judaism is of the opinion that mourning is a positive commandment to go through the mourning process. We're going to take a look now. We're going to take a quick trip through 3 different passages of Jewish thought, which stack one on top of the other the basis and the reasoning for why mourning is something so praiseworthy in Jewish thought. Let's start with text 5a, taken from Nachmanides. Page 89. The Torah does not forbid us to weep in response to a death, because it is human nature to be moved to tears when separating from loved ones and at their journeying away, even if they are alive. So Nachmanides approaches this from a very logistical level. Look, separation is hard. God put us in this world to be human beings. For human beings, separation is extremely painful, even in the event that the loved one who's separating from us is alive. And so we need to experience that pain. So we cry. So says Nachmanides, level 1, mourning is an acknowledgement of reality. The reality is we are now separated from our loved one. That hurts. It hurts profoundly. So we mourn. Let's take it up a notch. Text 5b from Maimonides. Mourners find comfort in crying and in arousing their sorrow until their bodies are too weak to handle the intensity of their internal turmoil. Just as happy individuals find contentment in various forms of light-hearted activities. Said Maimonides, mourning and grief are not just human conditions. It's what weak people go through. Weak people feel their emotions, so they cry. And what are you going to do? We're a bunch of feeble humans, so we have to mourn. No, says Maimonides. Mourning and grief, crying and sobbing have psychological benefits. In a certain sense, they're as beneficial for the person as happy people find in lighthearted activities. Being able to mourn properly is a healthy, cathartic experience. Comes along Reb David ibn Zimra, a great writer of responsa of Jewish law, and he takes it to even further a step. Text 5c on page 91. Question. This was a question that was posed to Reb David ibn Zimra. One of this generation's greatest personalities failed to shed a single tear upon losing a son. Is this a praiseworthy reaction? Answer. Such behavior is offensive and objectionable. It demonstrates heartlessness, distasteful character, and cruelty. This is the way of the philosophers who maintain that this world is without purpose. By contrast, we who have received the Torah are expected to believe and to realize that this world is of great value for those who properly utilize their time here and behave appropriately. It is through our actions in this world that we merit the world to come. Crying, mourning and shedding tears over the passing of a relative, and especially for an honorable individual, is the way of the pious, the prophets, and individuals renowned for their good deeds. It is not for naught that our sages instruct us to observe 3 days for weeping, 7 for eulogies, and 30 for restrictions on wearing new clothing and getting haircuts. We'll talk about that tonight. If weeping were improper, the sages would not have instituted a 3-day weeping period. In fact, the Torah emphasizes that our forefather Abraham came to eulogize Sarah and weep for her, and that Jacob, King David, and countless individuals of similar caliber acted likewise. Says Reb David ibn Zimra, let's take this in stages. Nachmanides says that mourning is an acknowledgement of a reality. Okay, we have to acknowledge reality, fine. Maimonides says not just that mourning is cathartic, it has psychological benefits. Comes Reb David ibn Zimra and says, no, beyond the fact that mourning is just an expression of emotion, an acknowledgement of reality, mourning acknowledges the value of physical life. By mourning appropriately, in accordance with Jewish law, we are paying the utmost respect to the journey of our loved one on this earth. And we are saying, wow, our loved one, this member of our family, was sent down in this world for a mission. They succeeded in their mission par excellence, whatever their mission may have been, and now it's time for them to go. It pains us greatly that their mission has concluded, because the time they spent down here amongst us, that's the important time. Where they go now to the trove of souls is of less importance than the value they provided to all of humanity, to all of God's great worlds in the time when they were here down in this world. That's what counts. And so in the Jewish faith, mourning is something so incredibly profound. Why? Because Torah's philosophy is that the purpose of all creation is this physical world and God's desire that we serve him. And mourning acknowledges that our loved one can no longer do that, no longer has the ability to be amongst us and with us and discharge their mission here on earth. And that is why in the Jewish faith, mourning is not just healthy, mourning is not just natural, but mourning is absolutely a positive biblical commandment. There's a question that has come in from our friend Jay. Doesn't the text say that the soul suffers in proportion to the distress of those mourners? I don't believe so. Last week, we talked about the fact that when we mourn with the mourners, we are not just mourning for their pain, we're also mourning for the soul's struggle. But the soul actually, as we're going to learn later on tonight, the soul actually is not bothered by the fact that the mourners are in distress. In fact, the fact that the soul sees the mourners yearning to have a connection with the soul of their departed one actually creates a bond of connection between the departed one and the loved ones they've left behind. So mourning is actually something which is exemplary and recommended, etc., etc. Any other questions, ladies and gentlemen? Or comments or thoughts or observations? Okay, earlier we qualified that the biblical commandment to mourn is for the next, I believe the exact terminology we used was next of kin or something to the, yes, next of kin we quoted from Maimonides. So just to take a look at exactly who that characterizes, and I want to provide an important qualifier over here, take a look at figure 3.1 on page 92. The Torah rules of mourning are limited to the following next of kin: father, mother, sibling, spouse, son, or daughter. Now, an important point of context over here. What do I mean by that? I lost my grandfather when I was 21 years old. It was a very, very painful experience. I had the good fortune of being with him quite a bit towards the end of his life, and losing my grandfather was arguably one of the saddest days of my life. Does Torah tell me not to mourn? No. The laws of mourning, the observances of mourning that we are about to talk about now, are limited to next of kin. Obviously, anyone who loses a loved one, a friend, a colleague, a mentor, in general, someone important passes away in our lives, it is a healthy and a beautiful and a positive thing to mourn. The Torah laws of mourning that we are about to discuss now are limited to next of kin. Dr. Adelson wrote a letter at the end of Shloshim. Yes, I saw that, Laura. Let's talk about that in a second. So let's talk about the key Jewish mourning observances. You can follow along on the big board, or you can follow along in your book. It's figure 3.2 on page 93. We're going to break this down into various time slots, as are broken down, in fact, by Torah. The first time slot for mourning is called Aninut. Aninut begins at the moment of passing, and it goes until internment. Ideally, this time period should be as short as possible. As we've talked about already numerous times during this course, Torah encourages us and indeed wants us to bury our loved ones in the shortest amount of time possible. So this period of time from passing until interment is obviously a short one because we want to intern our loved ones as quickly as possible. During the time of Aninut, we make no attempt to console mourners. We are cognizant of the fact that until their loved one is interred properly, the pain and the grief that they are experiencing is so intense and so profound that in respect of that, we make no attempt to console mourners. Second of all, the actual mourners, those who are next of kin, are absolved from mitzvot that require inactivity. So for example, putting on tefillin, saying the Shema, mitzvot that require inactivity, they are actually absolved from during this time. Obviously a negative commandment, so not eating pork, they're not absolved from that because it doesn't require any sort of activity to adhere to that, but positive mitzvot they are absolved from. And immediate family members, again, next of kin, tear a part of their outer garments, which we'll talk at great length about tonight. Quick disclosure, we are skipping on the big screen over here to Shloshim, which is the end of the 30-day period. To be fair, there's an important benchmark in between Aninut and Shloshim, which is Shiva, the 7 days of mourning, which we'll have a special section of the class dedicated to tonight. So as you see on your chart in your book on page number 93, Shiva has a whole set of laws unto itself, and we'll get to that, but we're jumping that for a second, and we're jumping to Shloshim. Shloshim is the 30-day mourning period commencing with internment. The laws and traditions for mourners: they avoid new clothes during Shloshim, they avoid haircuts during Shloshim, and they do not attend festive events during Shloshim. Following Shloshim, the next mile marker is the entire 12-month period, the first year of mourning of Avilut, which again commences with internment. This period applies to one mourning a parent. So God forbid if one loses a spouse, a sibling, or a child, they do not observe the entire year of mourning, only to those who lost a parent. Some Shloshim restrictions continue, like avoiding festive events, and customarily the members of the family who have lost a loved one keep a candle burning for the entire 12 months. Just an interesting tidbit of information, some of the festive events that people are required to observe during Shloshim, amongst them are weddings. Weddings are very joyous occasions, and weddings are a cause for great celebration, and it's not considered appropriate for a mourner to attend a wedding during the Shloshim. As it happens, in our communities, there are quite a few weddings, and especially now during the aftermath of COVID, or I should say the tail end of COVID, where we've lost so many, it's very common that families that, people who are slightly older, who have children of marriageable age, lost a parent and now have their child's wedding during the first year of mourning. This is not just a COVID reality. This actually happened to me. My grandfather passed away in the summer of 2013, and my wife and I got married in January of 2014. So what does my mother do about attending her own son's wedding? What do my aunts and uncles do about attending their nephew's wedding whilst they're in a period of mourning? So for a child, it's actually quite straightforward. For a child, we go to the children's wedding because it's also their joy, so the parents are allowed to attend. But for aunts and uncles, one of the things that's customary is that in order for them to partake of the joyous occasion, it's customary to have them serve. It's customary to hire them for the event, and so they're in the room more for their livelihood as opposed to just being there to partake of the joyous occasion. Once they're in there, they're already part of the festivities. But there are some very interesting workarounds for attending family weddings when one is in the first year of mourning. The last benchmark, of course, comes at the end of the year of mourning, which is the yahrzeit, which is the anniversary of the passing, which happens again at the end of the first year and then every subsequent year, during which we recite the Kaddish, we learn additional Torah study, and we do extra good deeds in memory and merit of the deceased. Let me take a moment to address some of the questions that have come in. Can immediate family members console each other, asks Jill. Absolutely. I would say that during the Shiva process, immediate family members are the ones who are in most proximity to each other, and it's absolutely beautiful and vital for them to be of support to one another. Laura mentioned the fact that Dr. Miri Adelson, composed a beautiful letter at the end of her husband's shloshim. It's actually very customary in many communities that a lot of the things that are done to perpetuate the memory of the deceased are done at the end of shloshim. In many communities, in fact, a headstone is put up either at the end of 30 days or at the end of the first year. But a lot of things that are done to kind of mark the transition from one mourning period into another, and obviously shloshim, beyond it being the end of one mourning period, is kind of the end of the immediate mourning periods, because you go from, right away the first mourning period into the first 7 days, into the first 30 days. The next mile marker is not for another 11 months. Shloshim marks the end of the really intense mourning. And so it's very, very common in the community that people do special things like writing articles about their loved ones, putting up tombstones, dedicating buildings, whatever it is, at the end of the 30-day mourning period. All right, any question on that as we continue to move along? Any question about the structure of the mourning process according to Torah? Speak now or forever hold your peace. Okay. We're going to digress for a moment. We're going to digress from the conversation around Torah's structure for mourning and have a fascinating conversation. Up until the 1980s, when psychologists studied grief, they focused their studies of people who were grieving on two different areas. We're going to call them for a second track 1 and track 2. Track 1 of grief studies focused primarily on function. Grief studies focused on the fact that people who were grieving, how were they engaging at work? Were they being able to maintain relationships and other interests? To put it very, very concisely, the first focus of these grief studies were focusing on the bereaved one, the one who lost someone, and how they are engaging with the outside world as a result of their loss. There were other clinicians, other doctors who were doing studies. We'll call those the track 2 studies, and they had an entirely different conversation. They were focusing on the person who was mourning, their connection with the deceased, and their separation from the deceased, how they were coping with being separated from their loved one. And you had a whole bunch of scientists and a whole bunch of very, very smart men and women who were spending hours upon hours conducting all these studies about how human beings grieve on two completely different tracks. In the 1980s, Dr. Shimshon Rubin of the University of Haifa, an Israeli fellow, came along, and in his groundbreaking research, he realized how closely interconnected these two different tracks of grief really are, and how, in a certain sense, a person's function is closely related to how they are processing their relationship with the deceased. How they are able to engage at work is going to depend on their connection with the deceased. If they're able to maintain other relationships and other interests in this world, has to do with how they are coping with being separated from the deceased. If you take a look on page 94, what's marked figure 3.3, Dr. Rubin's 2-track model of bereavement. It is long and it's very, very complex, and we're not going to get into all of the different correlations on his track now. But if you take a look at this 2-track model of bereavement, you'll see the two parallel lines going down the middle. Function on top and relationship to the deceased on the bottom. And Dr. Rubin's point is that every struggle on top is directly linked to a struggle on the bottom. If the mourners are feeling anxiety in their desire to get back to quote unquote normal life, it's probably because of negative perceptions of their relationship with the deceased. If they're struggling with depression, it has to do with imagery and memory. If they're struggling with traumatic responses, it has to do with positive perceptions, and so on and so forth. I could spend not just one night, I could spend a week going through Dr. Rubin's research and how he correlates these two different grief experiences. The point of how those two grief experiences connect one to the other is not the focal point of our conversation. In 2014, Dr. Rubin published an article in which he shows the following fascinating research. This 2-track model of grief, showing how one deals with grief and loss, and how the relationship with the deceased is directly correlated to their ability to function as a normal person in the world, actually closely models Torah's view for dealing with grief. Take a look at figure 3.4 on page 96 in your textbook. He breaks it down into the same 5 categories, the same 5 time periods that we just discussed. And he says the first slate of recovery is aninus, is that immediate intense mourning period, where again we talk about these 2 tracks. Very limited function is expected from the bereaved, because at that point they're suffering from an intense loss, because literally the body of their loved one lays before them. Then we move into Shiva. During Shiva, it's a time of limited function. Usual routines are suspended, because at that point there's an intense process of sharing memories about their loved one. And we continue into Shloshim. Outside responsibilities resume, because less time is allocated to focus on the loss. And the 12-month mile marker and the yahrzeit, the point that he makes is that Torah's process for dealing with grief, moving through this time, this chronological process from the first moment to the first week, to the first month, to the first year, is directly correlated to what scientists have been talking about for years and years and years, how these 2 tracks of processing grief, of dealing with the outside world, commensurate to our ability to have a relationship with our loved one, notwithstanding their departure, are so closely related. I saw this, I thought it was fascinating. You can Google his work. He's well published. He's written extensively on the topic. Again, Dr. Shimshon Rubin from the University of Haifa. If you're interested on the topic, we can literally go all week about this, but he is of the opinion that the correlation between the Torah timeline for mourning and how it breaks down for how people cope with it are strongly, strongly correlated. Any thoughts, ladies and gentlemen? Okay. So we spoke about a process. We spoke about the fact that Torah tries to provide a framework and a structure for people who are suffering with a loss, suffering with mourning and grief, to get back into themselves. Let's start talking about what that process looks like and what indeed Torah prescribes for the mourner to allow them to try and climb back into the saddle of normal life and begin to cope with the immeasurable loss that they have just suffered. One of the very interesting things that Torah mandates right in the beginning of the Jill, let's get hold off on the question just for a moment. We're starting right now at the beginning of the process, and after 12 months, we will get to that at the end of 12 months. Right now, we're at the beginning. One of the things that Torah mandates, as we discussed for the very beginning of the mourning process, is the concept of kriya, is the concept of rending one's garments. Interestingly enough, we find that the concept of rending one's garments is actually biblical, very, very biblical. One of the first episodes that we have in the Torah of loss and grief involves the concept of ripping one's garments. For those of you who took our course, Secrets of the Bible, we talked about this episode at great length. Take a look for text 6, Genesis chapter 37, verse 31. After the brothers sold Joseph, Joseph's brothers sold him, the brothers slaughtered a goat and dipped Joseph's tunic in its blood. They sent the colored tunic home, and the couriers brought it to their father and said, "We have found this. Please identify whether or not it is your son's tunic." Jacob recognized it and exclaimed, "It is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Joseph has been torn to pieces." What did Jacob do immediately upon realizing that his son, in his estimation, had been torn to pieces? Jacob rent his garments, placed sackcloth on his loins, and mourned his son for many days. Tearing one's clothing is one of the fundamental ways of beginning the grieving process in Jewish law. Here I will take a moment to dispel a myth. I'm not sure why. I'm not sure if this was a financial concern or what, but the process has emerged in American Jewry for people to take a black ribbon by a funeral and place it on their clothing and ceremonially tear the black ribbon. Recently, I was doing a funeral, and I shared with the young people, it was a bunch of young people who had lost their mother. Horrible, horrible story. She was 72. She passed away from one moment to the next. And we got to the funeral. We got to the cemetery, and the gentleman from the mortuary hands me the bag with the black ribbons. So I went over to the mourners and I said, "Listen, guys, either I can give you these black ribbons, which is pretty typical in American Jewry, or we can do this properly." And they looked at me and they said, "What do you mean properly?" So we can actually rip your shirt, which is what is mandated by Jewish law. And they said, oh, we didn't know there was a difference. They said, yeah, I mean, according to Jewish law, you're meant to rip your clothing, not a black ribbon from the mortuary. So they ripped their clothes. They actually ripped their outer garment, as is exactly mandated by Jewish law. And it was interesting, a number of people came over to me afterwards and they said that watching people literally rend their garments had such a profound impact on all those that were there participating in the funeral, friends and supporters of the mourners. It was so much more profound than watching them tear a black ribbon that had been placed on their clothes. And for me, for the life of me, I understand that a lot of concepts, a lot of customs of observant Judaism get swapped out for any number of reasons, and they're not politically correct and they don't go with the times. I hear you. Okay, we can, as Laura and I said before class tonight, we can agree to disagree. But for some reason, a custom which Judaism mandates to express the amount of pain and anguish that we're feeling in the moment, I'm not sure why that was replaced. I don't know why that was somehow considered to be not expedient or not convenient or too emotional, why it was swapped out. But according to Judaism, according to Jewish law, one is meant to rip their garment. The shirt that is on their back should be ripped and not a little pin that we put on and hand back to the mortician when we're finished. Let's talk for a second about the significance of rending our garments. Why is that so? Text 7. Rabbi Yaakov Chagiz states in Halachot Ktanot that mourners are instructed to rend their garments as a method of distracting from and reducing their overwhelming grief. He quotes, there's a Jewish philosopher that says that rending their garments is a way of distraction. Says Rabbi Yehuda Ayash, in my humble opinion, the opposite is true. Having to rend their garments brings mourners to tears and amplifies their pain. The goal is to actively encourage mourners to express their pain over the passing and to experience their tremendous loss. The first thing we do in the mourning process is we rend our garments. And according to Jewish faith, the rending of the garments is fundamental because tearing the garments gives us a certain reality check. This is for real. The pain that we are experiencing right now is for real. It is legitimate. It is irreplaceable. We are not going back to the reality the way things were before we lost our loved one. According to Jewish law, the best way to embark on the mourning process is to have a wake-up call, is to have a reality check, to actually tear our garments and then to wear the torn garment for the 7 days of Shiva as a way of sending a message that this is for real. The best way to embark on the mourning process is to make sure that the mourning process that we are about to set forth on is not one that is begun in some sort of place of denial, but from a very real awareness of what is going on in our lives. From the mourning process, we immediately continue to step 2 of the process, which we talked about earlier. We alluded to it very briefly, and we're going to get into the entire nitty-gritty of it right now, which is the Shiva, the 7 days of intense mourning that take place following a loss. I think probably the most profound text that we'll discuss tonight is before us, text 8, and one of the reasons it's so profound is because it's taken directly from the Talmud in the tractate of Moed Katan, the tractate that deals primarily with mourning, and it says as follows. Neither cry for the dead, nor bemoan him. Neither cry for the dead more than necessary, nor bemoan him more than what is prescribed. How are we expected to act? 3 days for weeping, 7 days for eulogies, and 30 days for restrictions on new clothing and haircuts. Once these have elapsed, God declares, you are not more compassionate than I. According to Jewish law, here's how we do it. We start with a process of acceptance. We continue into a process of processing. Shiva is all about processing the loss that we have suffered. However, crucial to the Shiva process is the notion that God tells the mourners, you are not more compassionate than I. Says God, I too have experienced a profound loss, and we're going to take Shiva to process that loss. We're going to take Shiva to realize how we can deal with the loss and move forward from the loss, because ideally Torah does present us with a structure that once the Shiva process winds down, we move into the Shloshim, we move into the 30 days, the mourning feelings should get less intense. We should find, ideally, some comfort during the Shiva process. Now, again, I want to make the important qualifier that one cannot command emotions. Torah does not mandate how we should feel. What Torah aims to do is present and provide a framework so that we can go through the comforting process during the Shiva period so that we can be best equipped to begin the healing process once we have wrapped up the Shiva period. And the question that we'll deal with over the next 40 minutes of class tonight is God wants us to process this during Shiva. God reminds us that we are not more compassionate than him. How indeed are we meant to do that? How are we meant to find comfort and move on? That is the question that we'll be dealing with for the remainder of class this evening. One of the beautiful ways that Torah provides for us to find comfort and move on can actually be contained in the traditional Shiva greeting. In Ashkenazi communities, when one goes to a Shiva house, when one goes to comfort a mourner, beyond the interactions that is had between this loved one and their colleague, their friend, their family member who is mourning, at the end of the conversation, traditionally before leaving the Shiva house, there is a traditional greeting that is shared between the two people. There's a traditional wish that is given to those that are mourning. And it can be found on text 9a in your book, page 100. Hamakom yinachem etchem betoch sha'ar avei Tzion v'Yerushalayim. May the omnipresent God console you along with the other mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. This is what we wish mourners in the Jewish faith. There are two beautiful messages contained within the traditional Shiva greeting. Have you ever noticed what sets apart this greeting on text 9a and page 100 of your book from what's traditionally said to a mourner outside the Jewish space? What do you usually say to someone who's mourning, to a loved one who's lost someone? I am so sorry for your loss. My wife and I send our condolences. We are so sorry to hear what happened. We are so sorry for your loss. Judaism comes from a very, very different place. The ability to find comfort comes from God himself. The first idea we share with the mourner is that we could have a parade of people who are coming to comfort you during the Shiva process and sharing all of their lovely sentiments with you. Ultimately, the ability to find comfort comes from God alone. It is really and truly only God who knows the depth of what you are going through right now. And as such, the ability to find comfort can only come from God Almighty and not from another human being. No one can try and provide that level of comfort. No one can try and fill the void that has now been created in your life. Only God alone. Furthermore, another very interesting part, unique part of the Shiva greeting, what do we say? Let's read it again in English. May the omnipresent God console you. Right? If I walked into a Shiva house and I saw someone who was mourning and I said to them, oh, Charlie, may the omnipresent God console you. That's beautiful. I'm sharing with them the sentiment that it's really only God that can provide comfort for the family. But then I add a whole second line, along with the other mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. Who asked about the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem? Why are the other mourners of Zion and Jerusalem part of the conversation? I'm here visiting a loved one, calling a loved one, being in touch with a loved one who's sitting to Shiva. Why am I bringing in all the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem? Explains Jewish thought, taken from a letter that the Rebbe wrote to someone who was observing Shiva. There's something profound by making the comparison to Zion and Jerusalem. Let's read text 9b together. It'll be up here on the big screen as well. In regard to Zion and Jerusalem, the Romans and before them the Babylonians were given dominion only over the wood and stone, silver and gold of the temple's physical manifestation, but not over its inner spiritual essence contained within the heart of each and every Jew. Over this, the nations have no dominion, and it stands eternally. So too, regarding the mourning of the individual, death dominates only the physical body and concerns of the deceased person. The soul, however, is eternal. It has merely ascended to the world of truth. Explains the Rebbe that when in conversation with a mourner, we share with them the following sentiment. Zion, God's home, God's sanctuary in this world, underwent a physical destruction. However, God's abode in this world has a certain element of spiritual indestructibility. And this is the idea we share with those that are mourning, that ultimately death creates a physical absence. And we're aware of that. We are here comforting you whilst you mourn for the physical absence. We realize the loss that you have suffered. However, we are also mindful of the fact that the loved one who created this absence, who left behind this absence, continues to live on in spiritual immortality. By creating the comparison to Zion and Jerusalem, the sentiment that we share with our friend, our loved one singing Shiva, is we acknowledge the pain, we acknowledge the destruction, we acknowledge the absence, but we also remind you of the timelessness of the one you lost, something which can never and will never be taken away from you. With that in mind, we're going to play tonight's meditation. Just give me 1 second and we will get it set up.
Today's reflection is going to involve an image which all of us probably have an immediate and strong reaction to. It is an icon for Jewish people all over the world and throughout the ages. An image that when we see it, we have a very strong and almost reflex response. I'm speaking of the image of the Western Wall, the only remaining vestige of the once glorious Holy Temple which stood in Jerusalem and was destroyed 2,000 years ago. We're going to use this image to help us in relating to our understanding of our relationship with those who have passed on. So imagine, if you will, in your mind's eye, the image of the temple, the glorious temple as it stood, as it was built by Solomon in its royal splendor, something that was revered by peoples all over the world. And now, juxtapose that glorious image with the image of the Western Wall as it stands now and has stood for 2,000 years in its destroyed state. Go back and forth between these two images. The temple as it stood in its glory, and the temple in ruins when we only have the Western Wall. The Western Wall is a symbol of destruction. The temple is no more. And yet, think about the hope, the strength, the inspiration, the spiritual and emotional energy that emanates from that image, even when the temple is in its destroyed state. Now think about a loved one who has passed on. Think about them when they were here with us in the physical world. Think about the situation at present when their physical body is no more. Are they really gone? Have they really lost their influence and power in your life? Or are they like the Western Wall? The Western Wall is an image of destruction, and yet the Western Wall is a symbol of inspiration and hope, pride, powerful, powerful emotions. Think of this image. Think of the feelings that it evokes in you. And now relate this as a symbol to those who are currently, physically, their vessel has been destroyed, but spiritually, their power is as great as ever. We'll take a moment now to reflect and to connect to this image and to relate it to our loved ones.
Hear me okay? Okay, I'm going to try this a little differently tonight. We've been having issues speaking on that computer. There are two devices here, but we're going to give this a shot. Along those lines, the comparison of losing a loved one to the destruction of the Holy Temple, along those lines, there's a beautiful, more spiritual explanation and significance given for rending of the garments. Earlier, we spoke about the idea of kriya, of ripping one's garments, as a reality check. This is for real. This is extremely painful. Let's read for a sec text 10 on page 102 of your book. Often within their pain, the mourners have an underlying belief that it isn't true, that their loved one hasn't really gone. This is not just denial. In a way, they are right. Death is not an absolute reality. Our souls existed before we were born, and they continue to exist after we die. The souls that have passed on are still with us. We can't see them, but we sense they are there. We can't hear them, but we know that they hear us. On the surface, we are apart. Beyond the surface, nothing can separate us. So we tear our garments. This has a dual symbolism. We are recognizing the loss, that our hearts are torn. But ultimately, the body is also only a garment that the soul wears. Death is when we strip off one uniform and take on another. The garment may be torn, but the essence of the person within it is still intact. From a worldly perspective, death is indeed a tragedy, and the sorrow experienced by the mourners is real. But as they tear their garments, we hope that within their pain, they can sense a glimmer of a deeper truth, that souls never die. In Jewish mysticism, the rending of the garment reminds us of the same reality, that the body is a garment. Soul never dies. The soul is like Zion. The soul is like the Holy Temple. The soul moves from one expression to another. It chooses a different garment. And so to show that idea of the timelessness of the soul, we rip the garments to signify that transition of the soul moving from one outfit, from one uniform to another. Any questions on this section of the lesson before we continue? Now we're going to get into the really tough stuff. In the beginning of the lesson, we talked about the fact that tonight we're going to speak about Torah's approach to grief. So we talked about that. Torah's a strong proponent of grief and mourning. You should do it, and you should do it in spades because it's healthy and it's positive and it's a mitzvah. But then we talked about the fact that there are some people, sadly, who are stuck in chronic grief. What does Torah have to say to a person who feels stuck, who is not moving along through the process? How can the Torah help a person who would classify themselves as stuck? Here, I need to make an important disclaimer because I feel it's something which must be said. Rabbis are not mental health professionals. Rabbis wish they were mental health professionals because they're paid way better than rabbis. But rabbis are not mental health professionals, and someone who is struggling with an issue pertaining to their mental health as a result of grief and mourning should absolutely consult someone who is a skilled professional in the field and not just attend a JLI course, much as we appreciate you being with us here this evening. Yes, I'm sorry, John. I know you thought this would be the be-all, end-all for every issue in life, but yeah. However, that being said, I do believe there are some profound ideas that Torah can share with us for someone who considers themselves sadly stuck in chronic grief. When we speak about the common emotional reactions to losing a loved one, obviously there are a dime a dozen, and the 6 that are up here on the screen don't even do justice to the dozens and dozens of different emotional reactions that people have to losing a loved one. Injustice, guilt, depression, sadness, anger, denial really only are the tip of the iceberg. So now we're going to focus on 2 and talk about those two and the insight the Torah provides to people who feel stuck in these emotions, particularly the ones that we'll focus on, guilt and anger. Let's talk about anger. What does it mean that someone is angry when they lose a loved one? By and large, when someone loses a loved one, there's a feeling of injustice. It's not fair. Someone is saying over here they cannot see me live anymore, just a photo. I see myself. Can everyone see me? I'm waving a hand over here. All right. Jill, there is a photo of me up, and there's also of me here live waving my hand. When we talk about the injustice that someone experiences after losing a loved one, obviously it differs by circumstance. If someone has a 90-year-old grandparent who peacefully passes away in their sleep, surrounded by their loved ones after living a great life on this earth, obviously the feeling that they're going to be dealing with most prominently is not one of injustice. Whereas someone who loses a 20-year-old child after a different battle against leukemia, like Stephanie that we talked about earlier tonight, obviously there's going to be a feeling of injustice. Where does that feeling of injustice come from? The feeling of injustice comes from a sentiment that this is not fair. The 90-year-old lived a great life, had kids and grandkids, and he worked and he retired and he had some money and he did a lot of good things and he was accomplished. Good for him. At the end of the day, everyone goes, everyone dies at a certain point, and so we understand that his time on this earth had run out. Anger comes from the sentiment that some people go before their time. What on earth is going on here? Anger comes from the sentiment, pardon me for a second, we are struggling with some technical difficulties. Okay, sorry about that. Can everyone see me and hear me? My computer's a little bit moody at this moment. I'm sorry. Maybe my computer feels that things are unfair. Maybe my computer lost someone near and dear to it. The idea of anger surrounding death is from the sentiment that we feel that certain things are unfair. People die young. People suffer. People die before we feel like it's appropriate for them to die, before they were able to accomplish anything in this world. And we feel that that is a horrific injustice. There is a fascinating, profound, and poignant story taken from the Talmud about one of our great sages, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was one of the central Jewish figures that oversaw the transition from temple life, from the centralized temple era, to the era of destruction and exile that followed. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, with his own eyes, watched millions of his brothers and sisters be murdered and sold into slavery. And that was his role as leader of the Jewish people. Yet he lost a child at a young age. And when that happened, he was inconsolable. And what happened in the immediate aftermath of his losing his child is the context of text 11. Let's read it. When the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai passed away, I'm going to read it a little quickly because we're very short on time. When the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai passed away, his students arrived to console him. Rabbi Eliezer entered and sat before him. Master, he said, would you like me to share a thought? Speak, he responded. Rabbi Eliezer said, Adam had a son who died, and he allowed himself to be consoled. How do we know that he accepted consolation? For it is stated, Adam was again intimate with his wife. So you should also allow yourself to be consoled. Rabbi Yochanan retorted, it is not enough that I am grieving my own loss, that you have to make me feel pained for Adam as well? Rabbi Yeshua entered and said, would you like me to share a thought? Speak, he responded. Rabbi Yeshua said, Job had sons and daughters and they all died in a single day, yet he allowed himself to be consoled. So you should also accept consolation. How do we know that Job was consoled? For he declared, God has given and God has taken away. May God's name be blessed. Rabbi Yochanan retorted, it is not enough that I'm grieving my own loss. I have to feel pain for Job as well. Rabbi Yossi entered and sat before him. Master, would you like me to share a thought? Speak, he responded. Rabbi Yossi said, Aaron had two illustrious sons, but they both died in a single day. And yet he allowed himself to be consoled. As it is stated, Aaron kept silent. His silence implied that he was without grievance and accepted consolation. So you should also allow yourself to be consoled. Rabbi Yochanan retorted, it is not enough that I am grieving my own loss, that you have to make me feel pained for Aaron as well. Reb Shimon entered. Master, he said, would you like me to share a thought? Speak, he responded. Reb Shimon said, King David had a son who died, and he allowed himself to be consoled. And you should also allow yourself to be consoled as well. How do we know that King David was consoled? For it stated, David comforted Bathsheba, his wife, and he was intimate with her, and she bore a son, and she called his name Solomon. So should you, master, allow yourself to be consoled. Rabbi Yechanan retorted, it is not enough that I am grieving my own loss, that you have to make me feel pain for King David as well. Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch entered. When Rabbi Yechanan saw him, he told his attendant, grab a set of clothing for me and be prepared to follow me to the bathhouse. For Rabbi Elazar is a great person, and I will not be able to hold out in the face of his comforting words. Rabbi Yechanan ben Zakkai had a feeling that what he was about to hear was about to be genuinely comforting. Rabbi Elazar entered, sat before Rabbi Yechanan and told him, let me share a parable. Your situation is similar to that of an individual to whom the king entrusted an article for safekeeping. Each day the man would weep and wail in fear, woe is to me, when will I emerge unharmed from this safekeeping role? You, master, also had a son. He was fluent in the Torah, the prophets and scriptures, in the Mishnah, the Halacha, and the exegetical teachings, and he passed from this world without sin. You should certainly accept consolation, for you have returned your deposit in perfect condition. Rabbi Yechanan responded, Rabbi Elazar, my son, you have comforted me in a most humane fashion. Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch was able to accomplish what his four colleagues could not. Something he was able to succeed in consoling Rabbi Yechanan by telling him, for you have returned your deposit in perfect condition. What did Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch say to Rabbi Yechanan that none of his colleagues were able to share? What was unique about his sentiment? Explain the commentators on the Talmud, Rabbi Elazar realized two things that are so central to our conversation. One, Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch acknowledged that everyone is different. Going back, I forget already her first name, Heather. Going back to Heather and Stephanie that we talked about before, the sentiment that Heather and Stephanie are processing their grief differently stems from the Talmud. Rabbi Elazar, the awareness that people are different, first of all. And second of all, he offered him a path to comfort. So often, in our haste to answer, to deal with this feeling of injustice that we feel when someone passes away before their time, we do several things. First of all, we say, hey, you lost a son? That must be very, very difficult. But come on already. Can't be that difficult. Adam lost a son. Job lost a son. King David lost a son. They all seem to have figured it out. So you too will figure it out. A, we don't acknowledge the individual mourner's path. And B, we don't provide them a path to comfort. We compare them to somebody else. We add more tragedy onto their tragedy. And we say, hey, well, if they figured it out, this can't be too darn difficult. I mean, they all got it right. A, we acknowledge that everyone is different. And B, we offer a path to comfort. And what indeed is that path to comfort, says Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch? Well, it's very, very straightforward. We acknowledge that life is a deposit. The way of offering a path forward is the acknowledgement that every breath of life that we receive in this world comes from the Almighty God. It is not given to us. It is not meant to be taken for granted. It is a deposit from God on high. And as such, when God gives us that deposit, if we can be mindful of that reality, we must realize that we have an exact time to fulfill the mission that God intended for us and for us specifically on this earth. If God intended for us to be 20 and the last 5 years of our life to suffer with leukemia, that is the unique mission that God gave to us in this world that no other human being alive from the beginning of creation ever could have done the same way. And so in the path forward that Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch offered to his Rebbe, offered to his teacher, he shared with him this notion. Life is a deposit. The short life that your son lived in this world was a deposit from God just as much as the 80 or 90-year-old lifespans of other people in this world. And just as the 90-year-olds are given exactly 90 years, not a day more or a day less, to fulfill their mission in this world, your son, who lived a short 20-odd years, fulfilled the exact mission that God gave him on this earth. And so indeed, when processing grief that seems untimely, that seems unfair, that seems unjust, these are the two messages that Jewish thought shares with us to cope with this grief, to get unstuck, to remind ourselves that life is a deposit, and we have an exact time on this earth to fulfill our mission with that deposit, to utilize that deposit. That's as it pertains to anger. The reality is
that another very common feeling that we feel as a result of losing a loved one is one of guilt. As a rabbi, I can't tell you how many times I'll sit with someone who has just lost a loved one, and I'll hear regrets. I'll hear regrets. The last time we talked, I wasn't so kind. I wish I would have connected. We haven't spoken in 4 weeks. Things weren't so good towards the end. So many regrets, so many feelings that it's too late to mend broken fences. There's something profound about those sentiments, though. Yesterday, you didn't feel that way. I would never say this to someone who was mourning. But if I come and sit with you on Wednesday and you tell me, Rabbi, I feel terrible. I feel terrible. This guy in town passed away. We'd been very close for 40 years. And then just last week, we had a disagreement. I said something to him. I shouldn't have said it. And now he's gone. I feel terrible. Yesterday, you didn't feel terrible. Yesterday had been a whole 7 days since he had said this horrible thing, which in your estimation, you agree is horrible and unfounded and just not good all around. Yet yesterday, you didn't feel as pained as you feel right now. Today you do. Why is that? Because as people who suffer loss, we feel guilt. We feel like a situation is too late. It's gone. It's over. We cannot connect with our loved one anymore. That ship has sailed and it is never coming back again. Explains Jewish mysticism that the antidote to posthumous guilt is to remember that nothing could be further from the truth. Take a look at text 12, taken from a great Kabbalist who lived in the 18th century in White Russia. Quoted actually in Jewish Law, he says the following. Children, page 108, when children say Kaddish for their parents, it is like sending them regards. When they learn a chapter of Mishnah on their behalf, it is like sending them a letter. And when they fulfill mitzvot and good deeds for the benefit of their souls, it is like sending them an entire parcel. The notion that a relationship that we had with our loved ones ends at a certain time, and at that point there's no redos, there's nothing we can do about anything in the relationship that we may feel may have been inappropriate, could not be further from the truth. We can send them regards by saying Kaddish. We can send them a letter by learning Mishnah in their memory, and we can send them an entire parcel by doing a mitzvah dedicated to the eternity of their soul. We have the ability to maintain an everlasting connection with our loved ones, and if we feel that there's a relationship that didn't end the way it should have, we have a way to rectify that. We have a way of seeing to it that the relationships that we have with our loved ones can continue to endure forever and ever. So Jill, you asked earlier, what happens after 12 months? Well, after 12 months, we no longer say the Kaddish, and the traditional Mishnah that we study after the prayers, we end after the first year. But the idea of doing mitzvot, of doing good deeds, dedicated to perpetuating the memory of our loved one is something we can do every day for the rest of our lives and every day for the rest of our children's lives. And the connection that we can continue to foster with our loved one, even after they are no longer here physically with us, that we can continue to create with their soul, lives on forever and ever and ever. And so for someone who is struggling with chronic anger, the reminder is that the same God who gives people 90 years and 100 years and 80 plus years, whatever it is, gives some people 30 years. And the mission they accomplish in their 30 years is just as complete and just as perfect as those who live for decades and decades longer than them. And for those who are struggling with chronic guilt, remember, this is not a situation to feel guilty. This is a situation to feel motivated. And what you can do for your loved one in the years after they are no longer with us can continue to foster the most profound connection even after they have gone on their eternal journey. Before we move into the last phase of the class, are there any questions? Feel free to unmute yourself or to chat. Okay. The Shiva house. Before we get into the Shiva protocol, let's take a quick look at tonight's lesson video.
When a loved one passes away, Jewish law calls upon the immediate family to experience the rite of Shiva. Approximately 7 days are spent in mourning and receiving comfort from visitors. A doctor, a rabbi, and an acclaimed lecturer offer personal reflections on the rite of Shiva.
When someone dies, the relationship with the deceased doesn't end. The relationship with the person who died continues. It just changes from a face-to-face interpersonal relationship to a relationship of memories, to a relationship of legacies. By engaging the mourners in this process, you're helping them make that shift.
The purpose of Shiva is meant for the mourner to be able to take that time aside from the affairs of life and affairs of the world, to contemplate, to introspect, and to share with others the life they had, with the person they loved. People come to visit and console and try to bring comfort to the mourner.
The structure of it and the formality of it, it gives a sense of relief. You know, when you're grieving, it's very all over the place, very hard to contain. And the structure of the Shiva brings a relief and a sense of conformity, which is quite redeeming.
If you want to help comfort the griever, what you're in essence doing by taking an interest in the person who's died is helping that person preserve his life.
I remember hearing people say things to me that was almost like they said it and the words stopped right here. But days and weeks and months later, they slowly made their way in.
The point of the Shiva is not to come up with anything brilliantly comforting to say, because there really isn't anything to say. Rather, it's just simply to be there.
One person who lost a toddler under very, very tragic circumstances told me what was the most comforting visit all week. And I'll say it the way he said it. He said an older gentleman with a lot of life experience came in. He said he sat in front of him and he asked to see a picture of his daughter. He gave him the picture. He looked at the picture. He cried for 10 minutes straight. He gave the picture back. He said the traditional verse that you say as you leave, and that was it. And he said that was, without a doubt, the most comforting visit.
But in retrospect, I have to say that that week of the passage between one reality and the next reality, somehow I have to believe in his infinite wisdom, God saw to it that this passage not be taken alone, even while feeling lonely.
Take on a mitzvah. Do something, and it can be tiny, but I'm going to do it in memory of this person, and especially if it fits with that person. That's comforting. Now the world's a slightly better place because of that person.
So in the brief time that we have left, let's quickly run through the basic Shiva protocol and talk about some elements of Shiva. Everyone hear me okay? Good. Page 110, figure 3.5 are up here on the big board. Let's talk about what happens on a very basic logistical. Enough, in the house where the people are mourning, we cover all mirrors and any pictures that are present in the house. The mourners are meant to remain in the house of mourning. Most people try to observe Shiva in the home of their loved one who passed. If that's not feasible, they observe it in their house. Sit on low stools within a certain distance to the ground, within 1.5 feet of the ground. They don't wear leather footwear. They avoid listening to music. No shaving or haircuts. Abstain from all work. They avoid Torah study. There are restrictions on bathing and laundry. It's meant to be a time of caring less about yourself and more about the grief you're processing. Prayer services take place in the home so the mourners can remain at home. Traditionally, people come to visit the mourners to go to a Shiva house. What are you supposed to do in a Shiva house? What are you supposed to say in a Shiva house? How does one fulfill a Shiva visit? We'll talk about this for the last 5 minutes of class with the premise that the following text really kind of sets the tone for everything we're going to discuss in the next 5 minutes. Text 14 on page 112, taken from the Gemara. Some of the most profound words in Jewish thought. Agra de Beitamya Shtikusa. The reward for visiting the home of mourning is for the silence. In the timeless words of my colleague, Rabbi Loshak, who you just saw in the video, who lost his dad, I believe, at the age of 23, 24. When you go to a Shiva house, the mourners are not expecting you to come in with something profound to say. You're going to come in, you're going to say, oh, your father died on Tuesday in January. It's because his soul, January, Tuesday. No. You come in there and you're silent. You're silent and you show the connection and the bond and the love that you have for the mourner. That's all. That's why you go to a Shiva house. Not to say something earth-shattering, not to share nuggets of wisdom that you thought of in the drive over. You go there to be alone with them, to be together with them in their time of feeling alone, of feeling isolated. In fact, that is something which is manifest in Jewish law. If you take a look for a sec at text 15, quoting from the Talmud, the Talmud says, comforters may not say anything until the mourner opens the conversation. According to Jewish law, when visiting a Shiva house, you are not meant to sit down across from the mourner and say, hey, how are you? How you doing? How you feeling? You are meant for the mourner to initiate the conversation, for the mourner to set the tone of, this is a conversation that I am currently comfortable having. And if I'm not up for talking about it, I'm not up for talking about it. I enjoy your presence. It makes me feel less isolated. But according to Jewish law, when comforting someone, according to law, we are mandated to allow them to open the conversation. Furthermore, and this is something which a lot of people for some reason find very counterintuitive, and it's important to point out, never attempt to lighten the mood in a Shiva house. Never walk into a Shiva house and say, gosh, it's so somber in here. Really, everyone's down in the doldrums. I should share a good joke I heard on the way over here. No, Shiva is not meant to be a therapeutic experience where people are feeling sad and you lighten the mood and you say something funny and everyone chuckles. It's meant to be somber. It's a process of going through grief, which at times is extremely somber. Another important one is don't say or ask anything intrusive. People will walk into a Shiva house. So tell me, your loved one, he died from cancer? Yeah, what kind? Why is that pertinent to the conversation? And how long was he sick? Did his hair fall out? Why? Seriously, you're there to be with them in their moment of mourning. Don't ask intrusive questions. Don't start meddling. Never a good idea. Another important one is don't philosophize. No one who has ever sat Shiva wants to hear your thoughts about why their loved one passed away. If you're visiting the house of someone who's lost someone at a young age, don't walk into a Shiva house and say, God takes the young ones. The young ones die early. Seriously. The ones who are suffering through this loss aren't there to hear your profound insight into why their loved one was taken at an untimely death. Don't attempt to philosophize. What should you do in a Shiva house? Well, number one, most importantly, the thing to do is to discuss the legacy, not to talk about the pain, not to talk about the suffering and the detachment, but to talk about the legacy that the departed has left behind. Number one, it directs grief from passive depression, from just feeling a void, to active mourning, to realizing that the loved one who had accomplished so many good things in life is no longer with us, but we can still take the time to focus on what he has left behind and the good that will live on in this world even after their death. It shifts the focus to the gift of life that was. Being able to discuss the legacy of the deceased allows the mourners to focus on the fact that God gave them, the mourners, a tremendous gift in the form of the life of their loved one, who accomplished remarkable things in his time here on earth, and it gives them the opportunity to really focus on the tremendous gift that they have. Third of all, it perpetuates the mourner's relationship with the departed. It allows them to realize who their loved one was and how they can continue to foster that connection with their loved one even after their passing, as we discussed. And lastly, what might be very, very interesting, and we touched on this earlier, I think, John, this was pertaining to, it's actually beneficial for the soul of the deceased. Take a look for a second. With this, we'll conclude text 16 on page 112. taken from the Medrash. The final word regarding a person, when God judges someone up on high, the final thing taken into account is that of the people proclaiming his deeds, commenting so-and-so was upright, so-and-so was God-fearing. When a person departs the world, God says to the ministering angels, see what people are saying about them. If they say that they had been upright and God-fearing, his soul immediately ascends to paradise. Interestingly enough, when someone dies, the final judgment that is made on their soul requires our input. And so the things that we say about the departed at a Shiva house, beyond being comforting and cathartic for the mourners, actually has tremendous significance and relevance for that soul that is currently undergoing the final judgment up on high. Before we go to the key points of tonight's lesson, are there any questions? I see Jay put one over here. It seems on page 113 that God bases his decision on what people are saying about him. Yes, God wants to know what our perception was of the deceased in this world. Obviously, God is the knower of all, but ultimately, God also wants to know how that person was received and perceived here in this world, and God takes our input very, very seriously. Anybody else have any thoughts or questions or comments before we move on to the key points from tonight's lesson? Okay. Oh, sorry. John's original question, he came back to it. Can it be postponed? I'm sorry, John. That's your question. Grief can be postponed in many instances. Due to logistics, it's impossible to mourn properly due to the fact that the body cannot be accessed, or a funeral is being pushed off to accommodate family coming in, or the body being taken out of the country, or whatever it is. And in that case, most observances of grief begin from the moment of internment. So the family is grieving from the moment of death until the internment, but Shiva and Shloshim only begin, the 7-day period and the 30-day period only begin from the actual internment. And so in that case, grief is considerably postponed. Yes, John, does that answer your question? I apologize for delaying it this long. Let's take a look at the key points on page 114.
Lesson 3, the morning after. 1. Everyone reacts to and deals with grief differently. No two people are psychologically alike, and no two circumstances of death and bereavement are the same. 2. It is a mitzvah to mourn the loss of a loved one. Processing a loss is critical to the healing process, and this is accomplished by Shiva, a mandatory period of grieving. 3. The Torah validates and encourages mourning, but only for a prescribed period of time, after which the mourner is enjoined to transition back to normal life. 4. Some ideas that give a mourner the strength to move on. A. The knowledge that the soul lives on and is not diminished by death. B. It is never too late to mend or improve our relationship with the deceased. Though our physical relationship has ended, we can still give him or her spiritual gifts. C. Life is a deposit, and God decides when to give it and when it must be returned. D. For this soul and its unique mission, this constituted a full life. 5. It is a mitzvah to comfort mourners. The most basic principle of comforting a mourner is simply being there. Our presence offers comfort and lessens the loneliness that often accompanies mourning.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, next week's class is going to be an exciting one. Next week's class is called Where We Go. Do Jews believe in hell? Well, we are about to find out next week. Next week, we're going to be talking about the journey that our soul takes to heaven, to hell. If there are such places in our faith, that will be all next week. I do deeply apologize for running you 5 minutes late. I usually try to take the time in class very seriously. Jay, I saw your question come up. I'm sure we'll have ample time to discuss that tomorrow. There will be a lesson recap and a recording of the video coming out either tomorrow or Wednesday. Thank you all for joining us. Please feel free to shoot along any comments or criticisms or questions or thoughts in email to me or a text or whatever else you would like. And I will see you all next Monday, February 22nd at 7:30 for lesson 4 entitled Where We Go. Have a good night. Stay warm out there. Stay safe. We'll see you next week.